This morning, our hearts continue to go out to Ukraine and anywhere in the world where violence rages. Once again, we come here to take our deep concerns and turn them into prayers and actions for peace. God, in your mercy. Today is our last Sunday of Lent, which, as you've heard me say for over a month now, is the season that invites us to examine our hearts as we prepare them for Easter. Today's also the beginning of Holy Week, the week when we trace Jesus' journey from his triumphant entry into Jerusalem until on Palm Sunday until his death on a cross, and then to the resurrection and Easter. This year will mark the beginning of Holy Week with two parts to today's service, two parts of that story as they're presented in the Gospel of John. Jesus' entry into Jerusalem, as you've maybe felt in the breeze already as the kids have waved their palm branches on the way by. And then also, more darkly, Jesus' trial, where things take a turn. As we do, we'll continue our Lenten theme of seeking God's ways, challenging ourselves this week to move from our desire for power over others and towards God's power with others.
Oh, hi there.
Yeehaw.
Hey, humans. Say, did you just hear a...
Yeehaw.
What's going on here? What? A puppy dog? It sounds a lot more like maybe a dog. Hey, I suppose you're going to tell me that you've got a donkey in your throat this morning?
What? No, that's silly. I'm just pretending to be a donkey.
But why?
Because I want to try out for the starring role in this morning's story. The donkey.
Today's story stars a donkey? I ask you, what can a donkey do that a llama can't do better?
Well, in today's story, Jesus tells his followers to go borrow a young donkey that has never been ridden.
I have never been ridden.
Lucia, would you like to be the donkey in today's story?
No, I want today's story to be about a llama, not a silly old donkey.
Maybe you should wait to hear the rest of the story and then decide if you still want the story to be about a llama.
Okay, Pablo, if you say so.
So anyway, the disciples went into the village to find the donkey, just like Jesus said, and brought it to him. Then Jesus got on the donkey and started riding it towards Jerusalem.
I don't think I would want a human to ride on my back. It would mess up my beautiful llama fur. But why would Jesus want to ride on a donkey?
Well, the people of Jerusalem wanted to make Jesus their king. So he chose a humble donkey to show them what kind of king he would be.
I'm confused. Shouldn't a king ride into Jerusalem on a big, powerful horse? Or maybe on a beautiful llama with lovely fur?
Well, that's the whole point of this story. Jesus wanted to show the people of Jerusalem what his kingdom is like. Jesus' amazing power does not come from big, powerful war horses or strong, loyal armies. It comes from his love for the people. And in Jesus' kingdom, it's not the big, powerful people that are honored with the important jobs. It's the lowly, humble people.
So he rode a donkey and not a big war horse. I guess that makes sense. But it seems so backwards. You said Jesus had amazing power.
Well, he is the most powerful king that there ever was.
This Jesus is sure an interesting guy. I don't love the thought of a human riding on my back and messing up my fur, but I guess it would be okay if that human was Jesus. But all of this happened a long time ago, right? Why is it still an important story today?
Because Jesus never stopped being the king. He is the Son of God, the Savior. The whole reason that we read the Bible is to learn about how to be a part of his kingdom. And the whole reason we come to church is to practice being a part of Jesus' kingdom.
If this story happened today, don't you think Jesus would choose a llama like me instead of a donkey? After all, I am elegant and smart, and I would protect him. I would spit on anyone who tried to hurt him.
I don't know, Lucia. Maybe he would just stroll into town with a bouncy puppy walking along beside him.
But that's not very dignified, and it definitely doesn't show off his amazing power.
Well, here's the important thing about Jesus. His power isn't about forcing people to do things his way. It's about loving people and helping them love other people.
I see. And no bouncing required, though, right?
Well, it's not required. But when you're with Jesus, you might not be able to help bouncing just a little bit, even if you're a dignified llama.
This is a great story, Pablo. Thanks for telling it to me. Let's ask the little humans what they think. Hey, little humans, can you think of a time in your life when love worked better than force?
Or maybe you can think of a time that you wanted to try extra hard to do things right for someone because you knew how much they loved you.
That bigger human over there has some pictures you can color to help you think about today's story. And Pablo, you want to go practice being donkeys?
You bet.
Goodbye,
Goodbye,
little humans.
little humans.
Hee-haw.
Hee-haw. Hee-haw.
All right, John 12 through 19. The next day, the great crowd that had come to the festival heard that Jesus was coming to Jerusalem. So they took branches of palm trees and went out to meet him, shouting, Hosanna! Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord, the King of Israel. Jesus found a young donkey and sat on it, as it is written, Do not be afraid, daughter of Zion. Look, your king is coming, sitting on a donkey's colt. His disciples did not understand these things at first, but when Jesus was glorified, then they remembered that these things had been written of him and had been done to him. So the crowd that had been with him when he called Lazarus out of the tomb and raised him from the dead continued to testify. It was also because they heard that he had performed this sign that the crowd went to meet him. The Pharisees then said to one another, You see, you can do nothing. Look, the world has gone after him. Now, John 18:19 through 24. Then the high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and about his teaching. Jesus answered, I have spoken openly to the world. I have always taught in synagogues and in the temple, where all the Jews come together. I have said nothing in secret. Why do you ask me? Ask those who heard what I said to them. They know what I said. When he had said this, one of the police standing nearby struck Jesus on the face, saying, Is that how you answer the high priest? Jesus answered, If I have spoken wrongly, testify to the wrong. But if I have spoken rightly, why do you strike me? Then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest.
John 18:28 through John 19:16. Then they took Jesus from Caiaphas to Pilate's headquarters. It was early in the morning. They themselves did not enter the headquarters, so to avoid ritual defilement and to be able to eat the Passover. So Pilate went out to them and said, What accusation do you bring against this man? They answered, If this man were not a criminal, we would not have handed him over to you. Pilate said to them, Take him yourselves and judge him according to your law. The Jews replied, We are not permitted to put anyone to death. This was to fulfill what Jesus had said when he indicated the kind of death he was to die. Then Pilate entered the headquarters again, summoned Jesus, and asked him, Are you the king of the Jews? Jesus answered, Do you ask me this on your own, or did others tell you about me? Pilate replied, I am not a Jew, am I? Your own nation and chief priests have handed you over to me. What have you done? Jesus answered, My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my followers would be fighting to keep me from being handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not from here. Pilate asked him, So you are a king? Jesus answered, You say that I am a king, for I was born, and this is what I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone who belongs to the truth listens to my voice. Pilate asked him, What is truth? After he said this, he went out to the Jews again and told them, I find no case against him. But you have a custom that I release someone for you at the Passover. Do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews? They shouted in reply, Not this man, but Barabbas. Now Barabbas was a bandit. Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged, and the soldiers wove a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and they dressed him in a purple robe. They kept coming up to him saying, Hail, King of the Jews, and striking him on the face. Pilate went out again and said to them, Look, I am bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no case against him. So Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, Here is the man. When the chief priests and the police saw him, they shouted, Crucify him, crucify him. Pilate said to them, Take him yourselves and crucify him. I find no case against him. The Jews answered him, We have a law, and according to that law, he ought to die because he has claimed to be the Son of God. Now, when Pilate heard this, he was more afraid than ever. He entered his headquarters again and asked Jesus, Where are you from? But Jesus gave him no answer. Pilate therefore said to him, Do you refuse to speak to me? Do you know that I have the power to release you and the power to crucify you? Jesus answered him, You would have no power over me unless it has been given to you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin." From then on, Pilate tried to release him, but the Jews cried out, "If you release this man, you are no friend of the emperor. Everyone who claims to be a king sets himself against the emperor." When Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus outside and sat on the judge's bench at a place called the Stone Pavement, or in Hebrew, Gabbatha. Now it was the day of preparation for the Passover, and it was about noon. He said to the Jews, "Here is your king." They cried out, "Away with him, away with him, crucify him." Pilate asked them, "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priests answered, "We have no king but the emperor." Then they handed him over to be crucified. So they took Jesus.
In the book, White Too Long, Robert P. Jones points out a contradiction in how many of us white American Christians have approached politics. During the Civil Rights era, as Martin Luther King Jr. and his fellow nonviolent Christian protesters were being thrown in prison in Birmingham and beaten bloody on a bridge in Selma, our most prominent white Christian leaders preached political separation and restraint. Jones writes, when Billy Graham was asked about Martin Luther King Jr.'s 1963 I Have a Dream speech, in which King inspired thousands to put their bodies and livelihoods on the line to create a world here and now where his children could play with white children, Graham, instead of using his tremendous platform to tell his many followers that they had the power to help do the same, replied, "Only when Christ comes again will little white children of Alabama walk hand in hand with little black children." And preaching in response to Bloody Sunday, named after the beating that the Selma police gave to King and his nonviolent followers that day, Reverend Jerry Falwell said this, "Believing the Bible as I do, I would find it impossible to stop preaching the pure saving gospel of Jesus Christ and begin doing anything else, including participating in civil rights reforms. Preachers are not called to be politicians, but to be soul winners." Now, you may not recognize that Jerry Falwell anymore, the one who said it would be unbiblical for him to get involved in politics, because you're probably more familiar with this Jerry Falwell, the one just 11 years later who preached the idea that religion and politics don't mix was invented by the devil to keep Christians from running their own country. Because indeed, Falwell did go on to mix religion and politics, founding a highly influential lobbying group for Christians called the Moral Majority. He became a major power broker in Washington. He met with presidents and helped to decide elections. So why the change of tune? How did Falwell, and as Jones also shows, millions of white Christians with him, go from preaching that political participation would sully the gospel to preaching that only the devil would want them to keep out of politics? Well, as Jones explains, sadly, in 1976, a white Christian college lost its tax-exempt status because it refused to rescind its racially discriminatory policies, and Falwell was enraged. And so he did a 180 on Christians getting involved in politics. The about-face is, of course, stunning, and the clear conclusion is this, as Jones puts it: when white supremacy was still safely ensconced in the wider culture, white evangelicals argued that the Bible mandated a privatized religion, casting black ministers working for equality as suspect Christians who were sullying the gospel with their political activism. But then, as those forces gained power, white evangelicals suddenly discovered a biblical mandate for political organizing and resistance. The contradiction is objectively ugly and should feel concerning. And I haven't even gotten to the part yet where Jones, the author, tells people like you and me, people who probably like to pretend we've kept our distance from Jerry Falwell, that thinking has seeped into most white Christian communities more than even those who keep their distance from Falwell would recognize. Now, I tell you all of this today, of course, because a higher percentage of black than white children are still bleeding on our nation's streets, because we again live in a time and place where Christians, white Christians, are asking, should we be out on the streets saying something? This is an important time for us to know our history, to grapple honestly with contradictions, implications, and possibilities for corrections. But I tell you about all of this on this Sunday because today's reading reminds us that Jesus himself was a victim of exactly this kind of religious contradiction. Consider this. In today's story, Jesus arrives in Jerusalem as a champion of the people at the bottom of the Galilean and Judean social order. The ladder looks like this. The Jewish people live under the Romans, their oppressive and militaristic occupiers. And under the Romans, everyday Jews live underneath the status of their own religious authorities. And it is in these everyday people, the people below the Romans and below their own religious authorities, that Jesus ministers more than to anyone else. In fact, even among the everyday Jews, Jesus gives shocking priority to the marginalized of the marginalized. In the Gospel of John, 2 of the most prominent stories about Jesus' ministry show him ministering to a Samaritan woman, whom he wasn't supposed to be talking to because she was a woman, and a looked down upon Samaritan, as well as a blind man. He heals with that spit mud pie we talked about back in chapter 9, who, as we can clearly see by the way his neighbors, the religious leaders, and his own parents treat him, was also seen as lesser than most everybody else. And yet, to make sure we know how critical those interactions were to the point of what Jesus wanted to do, John depicts these two characters as some of the most admirable people we will meet in the entire Gospel of John. Unlike all those leaders who interrogate Jesus, unlike Nicodemus, who asked what Jesus needed him to do and then equivocated, unlike Peter, a disciple who denies Jesus, the Samaritan woman and the formerly blind man immediately get it. They promptly run around announcing the good news. The Samaritan woman even dialogues like a peer almost with Jesus about theology. The formerly blind man refuses 3 times under intense scrutiny and cross-examination to back down from his testimony. And in case those things aren't enough for us to recognize how important these characters are to the gospel, they both recognize and believe Jesus is the Son of God long before anyone else does. In John's gospel, the prominent examples of what Jesus was doing are encapsulated in these two people near the bottom of the Judean and Galilean hierarchy. How do the religious authorities respond to this? Well, Jesus arrives in Jerusalem fresh off another miracle for an everyday Jew from resurrecting Lazarus, and the religious authorities are fearful about what this means for their power. They're worried because Jesus is so popular. They're worried because Jesus is upsetting the social hierarchy. They say they're worried that because of Jesus, the Roman authorities are going to come down hard on the Jewish people, but their attitude towards the formerly blind man would already seem to have suggested something else. It seems a lot more like they're concerned that if the Romans decide that they need to come down on the Jews, they, the Jewish authorities, with more privilege than the everyday Jews, are the ones with something to lose. The everyday Jewish people are rallying around Jesus, as we see on Palm Sunday, and they're not stupid. Many surely know that Jesus is putting them on a collision course with the Romans, and they embrace it. They are here for it, shouting Hosanna, waving branches. It's the religious authorities that have something to lose in Jesus' new social order. They're the ones doing almost all the scheming. And right here, I just want to pause to be really clear before I go further. I'm about to explore how these religious authorities pressed for Jesus' death in John's gospel. And I'm going to be really clear. I'm not saying that this is how the Jews pressed for Jesus' death in the Gospels. A lot of harm has been done because people have said that, even though, in fact, Palm Sunday makes it very clear that many, many everyday Jews were on Jesus' side. And in fact, Jesus was Jewish. The early Christians identified as Jewish. So what we're going to explore today is how religious power can do harmful things. Something that should make us, Christians with a lot of socioeconomic power, think more about ourselves, in fact, than anyone else. Okay, with that said, Jesus rolls into Jerusalem, and after chapters of preparing his disciples for his arrest, Jesus is finally arrested by those scheming religious leaders and their police and brought before them, where it is decided that they'd like to hand Jesus over to their occupying government, to Pilate, the governor. But here, Going all the way back to that little history lesson about white American Christianity that Robert Jones gave us, here is the thing. The religious authorities, like so many white Christians during the civil rights movement, have their reasons for wanting to pretend there's a separation from themselves and their government. It's about power over others, and it's about keeping that power. Here's the line where we begin to see it. So they took Jesus from Caiaphas to Pilate's headquarters, but they themselves did not enter the headquarters so as to avoid ritual defilement. In these religious authorities' society, their very status and power over the rest of the people relies on them maintaining that they are preserving their people's alliance to God over Caesar. Scholar Jamie Clark Soules emphasizes the religious authorities' posture in this moment as this: we serve God, but not King Caesar, they try to say by their actions, although then Clark Soules immediately adds, but do they? Let's find out. Let's find out if their allegiance is in fact to God, or whether, like all too many others, they are claiming separation from the power of government, from King Caesar when it benefits them, but are ready to change their tune if they need to. At first, they certainly stick to it. Pilate tries in various ways to draw them into his political process, and each time they resist. What are the charges? Pilate asks. Well, we wouldn't have brought him to you if he wasn't a criminal, they reply, distancing themselves from even saying what Jesus has done, wanting Pilate to even cook up the charges for them. Okay, Pilate says, then you do with him as you like. Oh no, they reply, we're not allowed to give him the kind of punishment he deserves. In other words, they've brought Jesus to Pilate and immediately backpedaled as far as they can, trying to maintain plausible deniability from anything having to do with the government, with Pilate, with King Caesar. But we already sense the hypocrisy. They want Jesus dead. They just don't want to be the ones to officially decide it. It already stinks, but let's see how it evolves. So Pilate grumps back into his headquarters and half-heartedly interrogates Jesus. Then he comes back out and says, look, I can find no case against him. Can we just say he's the person I release for you once a year and call it a day? No, they reply. Release that bandit Barabbas, but not Jesus. Keep the interrogation going. And now the cat and mouse game continues. Pilate has beaten Jesus, and then essentially comes out and asks, can I release him now? And the religious authorities, trying to get Pilate to do what they want while maintaining that deniability about their involvement, say, look, he said he's the Son of God, but according to our law, anyone who says that should be executed. So you should execute him because you're the ruler and those are our laws. But that's about as convoluted as it sounds. So Pilate goes back in and talks to Jesus some more and comes back out and basically says, nothing in my book says that this man should die. And the religious authorities backed into a corner where they must choose between maintaining their supposed separation from the government and preserving their power, which they believe can only happen if Jesus is dead. Make their choice. They begin to make their case on Pilate's terms, which means they appeal to Caesar, no longer God, as the authority over their situation. Everyone who claims to be king sets himself up against the emperor, they now plead. Shall I crucify your king? Pilate, kicking the ball back to them, says. What he said is an offense to you, not me. At which point the religious authorities make fully clear their choice, their true priorities. We have no king but Caesar. So crucify him. We have no king but Caesar. Just like that, it's happened. As Clark Soules puts it in her commentary, the very group that was so careful to keep their distance from defilement by entering the pagan space, by showing their priority to the king God over King Caesar, now pledges allegiance to King Caesar. It can happen, she adds, in any country, in any century. It can happen in any country, in any century. It sure can it? Because back in the middle of the 20th century, as black Christians invited white Christians to join them in making real change for some of this country's most vulnerable people, white Christians claimed that political separation was essential to their theological purity, until we thought our power and privilege might be in jeopardy. Then suddenly we weren't so averse to political games. Suddenly, powerful groups like the moral majority became coveted election allies. They became kingmakers. Allegiances were pledged to American Caesars. So now, in the 21st century, the question comes to us, too. Which king, whose power do we really choose? As we search our hearts honestly for the answer, let's be clear. Jesus did not teach that with God there's no such thing as power. Jesus taught that he and God were very powerful. Powerful enough to stand with those at the bottom of the ladder and to raise them up, to come up with them together. Powerful enough to ride into Jerusalem on a donkey like a king at peace, to celebrate his movement with his people, even though he was riding into a death trap. Powerful enough to stand before two high priests and a governor, all of whom held his life in their hands, and to have the audacity to speak to them as equals rather than smiting them as enemies, even as they tortured him. Jesus' way is full of power. That's the ultimate message of the gospel itself. But it's power that comes when you stand with others. And if you have something to lose, that can be a terrifying truth to trust. The religious authorities in Jesus' time held power over others, and they were terrified of what it might mean for Jesus to stand with the vulnerable and to give the vulnerable power. The religious authorities were terrified that if Jesus' power grew any further, they would lose their power over others. White Christians in the 20th century held power over others too, and many were terrified of what it might mean to be as much like Jesus as Martin Luther King Jr. was when he stood with the vulnerable. They were terrified that they might lose their power over others too. So here we stand, the 21st century, still invited to answer the same potentially terrifying but ultimately life-giving call. When the next Bloody Sunday happens, when the next letter from Birmingham jail is penned, when the next Trayvon Martin or George Floyd is murdered, when the next politician promises to do the dirty work for us to protect our privileged positions in work, in business, in school, in our neighborhoods, on the playgrounds, on the sports field, when we face just the daily decisions that require us to choose between the power of standing with the vulnerable and fight and, on the other hand, fighting to preserve our own power over others, what power will we choose? Do we choose King Caesar's, the way of power over? Or do we choose King Jesus Christ, the way of power with? To close our Lenten season, let's make sure we take some time to meditate on that as well. Now, with all that said, let's also move into our time of confession this morning, assuming that Mark's mic is going to be more like John and Lisa's was and less like Phil's was. I focused primarily this morning on Jesus' way of power with
We hope.
others in a world that tempts us with power over. Let's test it. Can we hear you, Mark?
I don't know. Testing.
We can. All right. I'm going to finish my little intro for you here, then we'll get started.
Okay.
I focused so far a lot on power over and power with when it comes to racial justice. But as I also tried to hint at the end, these are everyday, moment-by-moment decisions, too, about how we carry ourselves with other people. So, for example, I mentioned at the beginning of the service that the way we do sharing time, right, is an example of power with instead of power over. So to reflect on a story in his life that connects with today's theme in maybe a more everyday way as well for some of us. Well, it's all everyday, but in a different way, I'd like to invite Mark Nord to share his story from Zoom with us. Mark, you're ready?
I think so. If I don't have a coughing fit.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks for doing this. You told me that you have a story about the tension between power over others and power with others that harkens back to a time when you realized that you said you had an ultra-competitive side of yourself. And I'm guessing I'm not the only one who's intrigued to hear more about this supposed ultra-competitive Mark. So can you tell us a little bit about that time in your life and how you came to recognize that side of yourself?
Sure. I should first clarify that I'm not so sure that this is an example of power over so much as an analog or a way of looking at it. But then that's kind of what Jesus did too in his street theater with the donkey. So I was very competitive. I played to win. I created games. I had two younger sisters. I created lots of games that we could play together that I was good at. And in school, I played rough. I wrestled. I didn't wrestle competitively. In those days, we just wrestled in the schoolyard. And on the sports fields, I was very competitive. I don't know that I was that much more competitive than other people, but later I came to realize that maybe there's a little too much competitiveness in some of these things.
Thanks, Mark. Were you going to say more?
No, go ahead.
Okay. What did you notice was the impact of some of that competitiveness? How did you come to reflect on it, and what did you conclude?
Well, there's a family story. We came back from Central America to California, and our kids were in middle school. Chris maybe in upper elementary, and Eric in middle school. And Eric was not good at the sports that matter, partly because we drug him all around the world and he never had a chance to play basketball and football and baseball and things like that. But also maybe his hand-eye coordination isn't so good. He was a brilliant student, but in middle school, that doesn't count so much. He was not good at the games that mattered. And besides that, he was not a fighter. And I'd like to think that was his Mennonite upbringing. I'm not quite sure. But anyway, he got bullied a lot. And I didn't realize until a little later that seeing how competitiveness affected him changed my whole outlook on competitiveness. And I became much more aware of the people that I was competing against and seeing them as friends and of doing something together rather than something against. I should also clarify that later on, Eric found out that he was quite athletic, just didn't have that great hand-eye coordination or experience with these big sports, but he is a fierce bicyclist and runner, and he competed. He became competitive himself in bicycling, although I'd like to think he didn't fall into the traps that I had.
Thanks, Mark. Can you say a little bit more about how you see that experience connecting with today's theme and us seeking God's way of power with others?
Well, I'm not sure how much it connects, but I think one of the things it illustrates is that it's easy for us to be unaware of how our role in power dynamics affects other people. And especially if that's in a team or a tribal setting. And then I guess the final thing is that there is something freeing about letting go of that power over and enjoying power, sharing power.
Yeah. Thanks, Mark. You've talked earlier, too, about some of the nuances in the power of all. Do you feel like you've covered those, or did you want to talk more about that?
Well, I guess I should just clarify that I think competition can be a lot of fun. Competition and trash talking and the whole thing and playing to win can be a lot of fun, as long as everybody is having fun.
All right. So as long as the power is shared with. All right. Thank you, Mark. Thanks for your sharing. Would you be willing to lead us through our litany of confession this morning?
Sure. Holy One, we seek you while you may be found.
We call upon you while you are near.
Have mercy on us, O God, for our thoughts are not your thoughts, and our ways are not your ways.
Forgive us for seeking power over others, and let us instead seek power with and for others.
As we walk with Jesus on this Lenten journey, let us see our ways more clearly and follow your ways more faithfully.
Kids, if you have anything that you've been coloring, anybody else have anything you've been coloring, you can come on up, bring it over here. Anything else you've created for your offering for us today. When I'm done praying and we start singing, bring up your offerings. Let's pray using our adaptation of Psalm 63 for Lent. O God, you are our God. We seek you. Our soul thirsts for you. Our flesh faints for you as in a dry and weary land. Yet we have seen your glory. Your steadfast love has poured over our lives. Our lips sing your praise. We will bless you as long as we live through the breath you have given, the words that we utter, the work of our minds and hands, and the gifts of our inheritance. We give back to you so that all may sit in the shadow of your wings and share the joy of your abundance. Amen. In the coming days, as you walk the road of Holy Week and beyond, may God's way of power with others overwhelm you, embrace you, inspire you, wrapping you up in this world true power, allowing you to discard this world's false power and be with others in power where all are empowered. May God bless you and keep you. May God make God's face to shine on you and give you peace. Amen.
God of justice, Savior to all, came to rescue the weak and the poor, chose to serve and not be served. Jesus, you have called us, freely we've received, now freely we will give. We must go, live to feed the hungry, step beside the broken. We must go, stepping forward, keep us from just singing, move us into action. We must go to act justly. loving mercy in every way, walking home.